I guess a little bit of introduction from myself. So I'm Chris Ritson. I'm the Senior Risk and Uncertainty Consultant here at Safran Risk. And I joined a year ago this week, actually. So previously my career was in risk management. I've always been a risk manager, so day-to-day risk management as well as the modelling side of things. And when it comes to Monte Carlo, career going sort of 13, 14 years, highways, rail sector, major civil engineering, Crossrail, High Speed 2, etc. So I had an opportunity to sort of look at Safran Risk when I was looking at integrated cost and schedule risk analysis in the same holistic model. And I found Safran Risk to be the best tool. So that's a little bit of the background of me and how I kind of got into this. And what I've actually done is I've actually created this slide deck. And I think what we'll do is we're going to stick probably as much as possible to the slides because it covers quite a lot of ground in a reasonably logical order. But at some point I might just get annoyed with the slides and just dip into the tool itself and in and out if necessary. So we're looking at some underlying basics from the sort of the schedule, the risk and the cost model. So we'll be looking at importing projects, creating projects, customizing your schedule views and things, which there's quite a lot that goes into the schedule part of the tool. And of course, the risk bit is going to be of great interest to you as well, and the cost integration. So all of those things will get covered. So I'm going to just sort of start here with some real basics. Actually, is that in the top right corner, once you get the tool open, you see this kind of red ring that I've shown in the image there is what we call the burger menu. And underneath that burger menu, you will be able to find the latest version of the user guide, which is effectively a sort of, I think it's like 100 or 200 page PDF document. You also find the folder. So that's an important thing to highlight to you. So if you do have any issues that are not from a how do I use the tool, because you can ask me those questions, but if you have an actual problem with the tool where it appears to be giving you an error message or something, then the log file will be recording all those error messages and will give our support team clues to how to help you. And you can also see at the bottom it says about Safran Risk. If you click on that, it will confirm the version number of the software that you've got. So those things are important if you actually have sort of tangible problems, errors, bugs, if they were to arise. And already reach out to you, and they might even ask you to share the file that you're working on so that they can try to replicate it, and then advise what you need to do. So it's just worth pointing that out. But the other thing here is underneath that log file folder is also some example files which you can play with, which they're very simple. They might only be 30 or so activities long, but they just sort of help you play with something that isn't a real project, but just to get comfortable with using it, I suppose. Another thing is when you go through our sort of various tabs, you'll see this sort of options cog. Again, I've kind of put a red ring around that, and that will be context sensitive options for whichever tab you are on. So if you're in a schedule tab, it will be different to if you're in a risk register tab, etc. But that black ribbon you'll see in a moment is situated along the top of the screen, and it's permanently there. So that's kind of the main part of the user interface. But if you ever see a little pin icon like this, then that's interactive, it's dynamic, so you can kind of pin things in place. So there's various windows that you might find work for you and you want to have them pinned there. Maybe some of them are just in your way, you don't need them, so just unpin them. But before we get into the user interfaces in the tool, I need to give you a little bit of background on what the tool is. It's sort of the essence of it. So Safran Risk is an application, but it's also a database. So there's an underlying database that gets installed in the application. For you, have it on a server behind your company's firewall, and then you can all pretty much access the same information, unless you sort of set up some user permissions and things. When you're actually sort of engaging or putting information in and out of Safran Risk, then typically you're going to need a project schedule file. So I'm guessing you guys are using P6, so that would be a .xer format. You might have some subcontractors and things that maybe are using Microsoft Project, so we can import those as a .xml file as well. But the third and final file type for project schedules is our own Safran project file type. So you can actually share .spx files around with your team as well when using Safran Risk. So Safran Risk, or Safran project file, is actually coming from the original tool that was sort of 20 plus years mature in the Norwegian oil and gas. It's comparable to P6. So if you've ever used those kind of planning tools, you'll be fairly familiar with a lot of the terminology and the behavior of the sort of scheduling aspects. But .spx is what we use. So the first component is the project schedule, and then the next component is the risk model. So as you start building cost, risk, etc., then this can also be imported and exported as a single .xml. And the risk model will things like your global risk register, project level risk register, your calendar risks, your schedule risk mappings, so the various sort of the risk mappings to the schedule activities. Also similar to any risk registers items to your cost model, any correlations from the correlation matrix, and we've also got an advanced function called scripting. So if you've written any scripts, then that will also form part of the risk model. But that's a fairly niche function, so it might not be something that all of you use or any of you use, but it's a function that we have nonetheless, and it's captured inside risk model. Of those, you can actually individually import and export your global or your project registers, your calendar risks, and your various risk mappings. So those can come in and out of the system as individual files. However, just because it's easier, you might want to just send a whole bundle, and your and scripts don't have that functionality. So correlations would potentially break if you didn't have all the component parts, which is why it's important to save it as part of the full risk model. And scripts, you can actually just copy and paste that. It's because it's just like a text file, text document. So it doesn't need its own sort of import export, I suppose. But there's some very basic concepts in where you can find extra help, and also the kind of the essence of how the software is working in the background. When you actually open up the software for the first time, you'll come to this kind of welcome page, and you can see on here that you've got part of the black ribbon that we mentioned earlier. You won't see it fully populated. It fully populates once you've opened an actual project. But you can also customize which parts of that black ribbon you can see from the options cog that you can see on the screen there. Once you have opened a project, the kind of the full black ribbon broadly looks like this. So what you've got is, if you've used Primavera risk analysis, you'll be familiar with the kind of old sort of Microsoft style drop down menus and things. As a sort of user interface, it can get a bit difficult for non-users of the software to understand where you are in the process. So when they put together Safran Risk, they were very keen to make sure that there was a very obvious workflow where you could kind of see the breadcrumbs, and other people that if you were collaborating with, doing risk workshops with, you could sort of see where you are in the building of the model. So that workflow broadly looks like this, where you have the inputs on the left hand side on the black ribbon, analysis options for how many thousands of iterations, etc. you want to run the Monte Carlo, and then you got your outputs on the right hand side. So all the sort of traditional ones you expect from a Monte Carlo output, such as histogram, S-curve, tornado graphs, drivers there, but also we've got a few additional ones that are just part of Safran Risk, such as sensitivity analysis by exclusion, the scatter plot for your integrated cost and schedule analysis, which also covers something called JCL, or joint confidence levels, so we'll explore that a bit later. The distribution comparison for creating all manner of what if scenarios, or just comparing pre versus post, etc. And you can save as many S-curves as you like into that distribution comparison, because it's a database. Just remember lots of files and things floating around the place, which you might with other tools. So that's the kind of the overall sort of structure in that ribbon. It kind of holds your hand in a way, so you kind of step through from left to right, and then that kind of helps you ensure you're building a quality model. So you know, you can see that you've actually kind of covered each of the inputs, and you can go through those with your team as part of a workshop and make sure that you kind of validate the quality of those things before proceeding. And you'll see that there's actually lots of ample feedback mechanisms that are very visual for those that haven't seen the tool yet. Okay, so just looking at importing a schedule then. So when you hit that button from the home screen to import, first of all, you're going to sort of see some of the kind of obvious things that you're going to expect to see. You know, where's the file location, etc., that you're bringing in from. You'll be able to choose the name that you save it as within your database. There's a few options that you can toggle on and off here as necessary, but typically you're probably going to want to include all of them. I like to highlight this one here. This is important. So a minimum planning unit that gets set here, or set calendar units. Now you can choose, you know, days and other options. So here, can't you change data? So once you've kind of gone through this import process, it kind of gets anchored in place. So that might be important for you. Certainly, it's important from my career where maybe we were doing a big project versus that big project having very discrete and maybe weekend turnarounds with like possession planning on the rail network, for instance, where you might actually be more interested in minutes. So, you know, setting the minimum planning unit to minutes and days will have ramifications for how it portrays and behaves later on. So it's just important to kind of point that one out. You're also prompted here with a kind of option to overwrite what you've already got on the database or append or an update. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining this, and I'm sharing the slides with you, and there's this whole bunch of text that I've just kind of copied from the user guide. So this probably will mean more to some of you than others. It's not something that I tend to need to worry about so much, because you've always got the ability to just go save as a different name and go, this is version 2, or this is the next month. So you can always have multiple versions of the kind of iterated schedule being imported one after the other and save them as separate items in your database, or you've got these options here. Just let you read those and absorb time, because depending on how you want to use the software, you know, this may or may not be relevant to you. But as you proceed with your schedule import, you'll get all the kind of user-defined fields that you're probably familiar with from P6. And this is the kind of the metadata that essentially will help you configure your layouts and the views of the projects. And I'll show you how that works later. A lot of the text fields, I mean, they can grant you up to like 1,000 characters of freehand text, and they go down to quite a lot of levels, you know, 25, 30 levels in some cases. So there's a lot of flexibility in there, and I think it's superior to what P6 has. I think I've not used P6 myself, so I'm not 100% sure on that, but it'll be comparable to, if not better than, P6. And we've also got the outline code. So if there are work breakdown structures, which are essentially like a hierarchy tree, you can define those as well under outline code. And then when you come to this tab here on the end, which is the risk, this is where you can do the mapping if you have already got 3-point estimates captured inside your P6 schedule. So you'll be able to open up the drop downs and then ensure that those are mapped. If for some reason you can't find them, it might be that where they're being stored in P6, maybe it's under like a text field or something like this, and whereas you're hoping to find a number, typically a duration value like 3 days, 5 days, whatever. So there might be a reason for that, but it's not the end of the world, because it will still get imported. It just won't get imported into these free categories or fields, and you can just run a global change effectively. We call it assign fields, where you run a formula, it just copy and paste it from one to another, and then you've got it in the right place. So no need to panic if you can't find them in there. So once the import has run, and hopefully there'll be no issues, but once it's imported, you'll get the kind of the auto detection of all the schedule warnings. So clearly, if you are importing, I don't know, a 50,000 line item schedule created by many different schedulers who are, you know, maybe they've got slightly different approaches to working or something, maybe there could be quite a lot of these schedule warnings, and they'll automatically flag. And if you've used PRA, Perp Master, then you'll be familiar with the kind of schedule warnings that that's actually talking about. So, you know, the relationships, lags and things, constraints and whatnot. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail soon, but just to highlight that that will automatically refresh. So as you sort of start making changes and edits to the schedule itself, those will automatically detect. So just to explain this screen, so if you're using Primavera, which I believe you are, then this layout is relevant to you because it will default to this as part of the import process, and you'll get these columns generated that say PV, which stands for Primavera, and it will show you the Primavera duration, the start and the finish date, and that then allows you to compare and contrast how, if any, differences of interpretation between Safran's interpretation and the original P6 interpretation. So this is like a validation step, and it's there for your peace of mind and your self-assurance that the import process has been successful. And clearly there can be a multitude of reasons why maybe there are deltas and differences, typically calendars, but also one that might occur is simply someone making edits inside P6 and forgetting to hit the F9 button to recalculate. So if it doesn't recalculate there, but then you import it into Safran, Safran automatically does all the calculations or refreshes the calculations. I believe that's something that you can set off and you can manually do it, but I think as default it's set on. So it would detect those changes. And then the layout goes a little further in that it shows you some green bars on the Gantt chart view for the P6 interpretation versus, you know, the red and the blues for the Safran. So it should be reasonably obvious to then kind of do a bit of error chain analysis and step back through to see and find where the deviation has started, if there are any deviations, and it will just help give you some clues. And as I said, it's for your peace of mind and self-assurance. So, you know, the screenshot I've got there is exaggerated to show you how it could look. Not saying it will be wrong. I'm saying that it's just there to just as an extra tool. And I think it's the kind of thing you'd have to probably run anyway if you were doing using PRA, for instance, because PRA hasn't been updated and developed in several years. So whereas P6 is continually updated, so there can be deltas and differences for different reasons there as well. But we don't have this automatically generated layout for any of your Microsoft project or .xml imports. So it is just there for Primavera, and I'd say 90% of our customers do come from a kind of P6 background, so that's why we have it. Well, once you've done and you're satisfied that the import's been successful, you're probably not going to want to keep looking at this particular layout with those columns and that Gantt chart. So there's a drop down at the top there for layouts, and you can change that back to one that you've created earlier, one that works really well for you and your team, or just to a different one of the default ones that are provided in Safran. So I'm going to sort of give you some idea now of some of the other parts of the scheduling tool. So that the schedule tab on the black ribbon, because this is what would sequentially happen first as you would import the process. Sorry, import the schedule and things like this. Before necessarily doing any of the other things. But you've got some options here that gives you some summary information. So if you just need to find, or see a view of what's actually been included, you might find that useful information. So you can see that there's a kind of underneath the overall schedule tab on the black ribbon. If you move over on the sub tab to project, and then there's a button there that says summary. There's also another summary, which is back on the home screen, but it's a very high level and generic kind of summary, and it tells you a little bit on activities, how many risks and how many cost element items you've got in your cost breakdown structure as well. So I'm just now going to sort of jump back a little bit to this screen. So that was how you import typically from P6, but if you were creating a new project, then just the wizard would look a bit like this. So you'd go with, say, project, selecting the name, description, etc. And again, you've got that lowest planning unit or lowest duration unit, and it can't be changed once you've sort of set this wizard in motion and you concluded it. So just be careful with that. There's a few other things there. You can see that there's calendar sets, resource user fields and things, symbol sets. So there's a lot of extra detail there that you guys can come up with something that works really well for your team and then ensure that you have consistency around. So that might be worth exploring as well. But I'm going to just kind of keep moving through the process, but it's something we can come back to if you want to talk more about it. So there's various scheduling options, but a really important piece is what you might have called data date in Safran Risk is called time now. So I've just kind of highlighted that as a red ring there, and that time now can actually be changed later on. That's not fixed in place, so that's all good. But this is where you'd find it as part of the create new project process. And then once you've got it created, the overall kind of layout of that scheduling screen is that you've got those sub-tabs that I mentioned. You've got your kind of tabular information on columns on the left-hand side, as you've already seen, the Gantt chart on the right with a timeline up just above that. And at the very bottom, you've got some details. So that details portion is also quite dynamic. It can be changed to show other things. And quite often, just right-clicking on any part of the screen will give you some other options as well. It's worth pointing that out. So let's see, so setting defaults. So I think this is something that might be relevant to those of you that are either creating a high-level schedule network of maybe just a few hundred activities, and you want to build it for yourself rather than importing. Then you might want to look at the default settings here. So under schedule and then the project tab, you can see on the right hand side there's a button that says user settings and defaults. If you click on that, you can then start setting up things so that it just works a bit faster for you. So if you want it to have certain calendars or certain default durations every time you add a new activity, just this kind of thing, some basic stuff there. So it's worth just playing with that once you've sort of opened up your project for the first time and just seeing what works well for you. But the views, so you can change the views quite a lot, and I guess you could do this in PRA as well, but the bottom panel, you can see I've highlighted it under the yellow kind of box. So that previously was activity information, is this a hammock or is it an activity or a milestone, and maybe the constraint dates and things, all that kind of detailed stuff was there previously by default. But you can see that you can change what's on display in the yellow box by clicking here on the buttons within the red box. So if you go to the view tab, you've got activity, link information, resource loaded information, showing this as a histogram, and there's also the logic navigator, which you might find quite useful and quite I guess diverse, dynamic, quite customizable. So you can see there that we've got it set to link information. So inside the yellow box, you can now see predecessors and successors, and then in that you can see it says column list just at the top of both of those lists of predecessors and successors. That's because you can actually choose what are the individual columns that you see in that view. So you don't have to see type, lag, calendar, split target, early finish link, and so forth. You can make edits to those things if needed. So there's a button there that says columns, which is now in the red box. That will allow you to make edits and changes insert or remove columns as necessary. You could also just right click on the columns or the headers, I should say, of the columns, and you can make some edits and changes there too. What am I showing here? Symbols. So symbols, if you right click in the Gantt chart and then click symbols, you can then start making changes to how the visual looks on the Gantt chart. So I've got that set. As you can see, there's a legend just above the predecessors at the bottom of the screen, which shows you can just kind of show what things, you know, what do the symbols mean, or what do the colorations mean, etc. in there, and that's fully customizable. You don't have to show everything in that legend. Okay, important point here when you're starting to look at views and layouts and things is there's a box I've highlighted on the top left corner that says outline view or group view. If you want to start doing clever things with your view and you want to see things by a work breakdown structure or maybe geographic or chronological, anything your imagination can come up with, then you're going to need the group view button selected, which I believe it is as default, I think. But then under the group properties, which is roughly in the center at the top, also highlighted by a red box, that's where you start playing with the order of things. So you click that and you would then be able to start saying, well, I want to see things ordered by first WBS and then I want it by chronological or subcontractor or some other user defined field. So there's a lot of versatility in that, and it actually has some relevance to how you do risk mapping, as I was just sort of alluding to, because it means that you can take like an estimating uncertainty value and apply it to everything within a particular geographic region, or you could reorganize your data, slice and dice in a different way, and then map, you know, a risk or an estimating uncertainty to everything for a different purpose, for a different reason. So it's very flexible. So yeah, for instance, I didn't realize I had this, but if you have like a user field here, which is just the generic text-free user-defined field, normally empty, but someone has actually gone through in P6 and they've added L, M, and H, low, medium, high. They didn't have time to give you a full 3-point estimate, but they put L, M, and H. So I've now reorganized my information, not by work breakdown structure, but simply by low, medium, and high. So you can see that that column in the center there is showing the L's, the M's, and the H's, and you can see that the nodes have changed, so we're no longer looking at a WBS, we're now seeing everything under H's and L's as well. So that means, just getting ahead of myself, but it means in conjunction with other things like the filters, which are now being shown, that you can actually show whatever is pertinent for an upcoming risk workshop. So again, going back to my example where you might have several tens of thousands of activities, if you want to shrink down the scope of what you're about to talk about for the next hour with your team, because you've only got 1 hour of their precious time, you start playing with the filters like this. I just want to show it in this way, organized by WBS or low, mediums, highs, whatever, and I only want to show the testing phase of the project like I've done here through clicking that button. Sorry, this is the thing. This is why I felt, oh, maybe I want to jump out into the live tool. I'm still in the slides here, so I'm kind of on the rails. This is just an example of how you might set that filter up. Just click on that button in the filtering portion of the screen, and I've got things there for the testing phase. But then when you move over on the black ribbon to the risk mapping, the power is that now I only see 6 out of 31 activities because I've filtered down to just the testing phase, so I can only see those 6, but also you can see I've got my L, M, and H as the nodes. So now when I come to mapping and cascading those low, medium, and high estimating uncertainty ranges, it's very easy to just click on the node and all the child elements will snap to that. Clearly, if this was a work breakdown structure, or if it was by subcontractor, I could have an estimating uncertainty specific to just that subcontractor, because maybe we've used that subcontractor. So we've got good how well they perform based on what they quote. So that's where some of the power of the global risks that I mentioned earlier can come in as well, because that can act as a repository, as a historical repository, as evidence for future projects. So if you're running a project that's going to last for 5, 10 plus years, then that might be something you would like to investigate in using that. But broadly speaking, that speaks to the power of this. And there's also, even here on the risk mapping screen, you still got more filtering options available to you as well within this screen. So if you wanted to see even less, like maybe you've got 200 risks on your risk register, you could shrink that down and just show anything with the the spelling of DES for design, and it will just show you anything with DES in the title of the risk. So I think you'll find that really useful. And I like to spend a bit of time just talking about it. And as I said, there's the extra filtering options with the blue arrow, so pointing that out there, and a few more red boxes have just popped up. So you've got a risk filter, and also the those little squares within the red squares, if you can see those. I am sort of hovering my mouse around them. If you click on those, you'll find it pretty much behaves like an Excel spreadsheet in terms of giving you So one of the other views is the logic navigator. So this is a little bit like the one we saw earlier, which had the predecessors and the successors, but now we're going for a bit more detail. So again, fully customizable, show what you like, but essentially you've now got your predecessors shown here, but underneath the selected one, you get all this extra detailed information. So in some ways, this might be the preferred use for heavy users. Very detailed users of the tool, and you can, as I say, customize it in terms of what it's showing. Excuse me. In the middle here, it will show whichever activity you've actually got selected on this, from the schedule itself. So these are the predecessors of whatever is selected. These are the successors of whatever is selected. And again, you just got these kind of scroll bars, and you can just go up and down those and see all the information, and you can make edits in here as well, which is very useful, which is probably good. Clearly you can see there's a go-to and a go-to successor predecessor button at the bottom, but equally I think you can just double click each of these and it will scale you up and down the ladder, so to speak, in the sequence. So yes, we covered that. Yeah, I mentioned about it. And yeah, that's how you edit what's in the lists and things. Just right click on those. Right, representing the schedule time. So there's the timeline that's above the Gantt chart. You can right click on that to bring up some additional options, to anchor it in place or move it around as necessary, and make some sort of just changes to the visual aesthetic of it and the behavior of it, and zoom to best fit and things. We mentioned about the time now as well, so that's under properties, which can be edited at any point. You can click and drag to move around, and you can also click and drag with your right button, and your left button will do different things in terms of zooming in and just scrolling it, moving it around. Right, a little bit more on layouts. So there's a button there that's highlighted with the red circle at the top. As you click on that, you'll see all the different layouts that you've actually got. Now I've got quite a few there for different purposes, and that's because I've configured different views. So that the layout is a summarization of which columns you've got on display, but also what did the Gantt chart visualization look like. So you can see here in the one that's on screen now, just under the legend, it says P80 duration and timing. So there's a kind of salmon pink color that you can't actually see in here because it's probably not run the analysis yet, or more specifically, it's mid-analysis. I can see it says iteration 46. So because it's not concluded the analysis, there is no P80 calculated yet. It's mid-progress. So that would account for why you can't see anything in there. But that's just one of the changes I've made to this particular layout, and I've also got a lot more information on which risks are impacting during that iteration of the Monte Carlo, the random simulation sampling. But it's from this button here that you can see all the different ones that you've created and saved, and then you can rename them, change them. You can assign them to different symbol sets and things, and this is how you make those edits and changes. And once you've got them how you like them, you might find that if it works really well for you, it might work really well for your team. So if you want a consistent approach to life, then you'll probably want to share it, which you can do. And I'll show you how to. Oh, here we are. Sharing layouts. How logical was this? This is wonderful. Okay, so on the schedule tab, if you go to file this time, you'll find an export button, and there's layouts. So you'd be able to then, as I say, share, email that across to your colleagues, and then they can import that layout and it will work for them too. You can, so I know we already touched on this, you can manually make any adjustments to the schedule, just as you could in PRA. So you can change things, constraints, you could change the durations, you can change the logic links, you can make any change that you like. As I said, it's a fully fledged, fully matured, comparable to P6 kind of piece of software in terms of scheduling. So all the things that you'd expect to be able to do, like just start adding new activities as well, you're free to do that. So that's just showing you the right click. If you were to right click into the columns, this is the pop-up that you would have seen, or the menu you would have seen. So I mentioned that you can link. You can also do drag and dropping as well on the Gantt chart on the visualization, if you prefer to do your linkages that way. Scheduling, logic linking. Yes, and when you are under like those logic navigator views and things, you can edit those links in terms of like, is it a finished start, finish, etc. There's little drop down menus all over the place for these things. Resources. I should probably point out that if you've imported a schedule that is fully cost resource loaded, it will bring all of that in into Safran Risk as part of the import process. However, if you want to, you can edit them inside Safran Risk, or if you're creating a new project from scratch, then again you could just build your resource table from scratch. That is also easy to do. You could, I don't know if I've got a screen for it in here, but you can actually change the profile. So if you want to front load or rear end load the incurrence of cost, you can make some adjustments to that as well. So this is all possible to do. And I will have to come back to talking about a resource loaded schedule for cost modeling purposes a little bit later as well, because there's a couple of different ways that we offer you to approach that. But you can see that you could, once you've created your resource table from the sub tab, you could insert a column and then just easily select which resources apply to each activity as necessary. And in case I haven't already mentioned it, we allow you in Safran Risk to go down to the minute when it comes to planning and scheduling. So if you use the sort of suffix of M for minute, H for hour, D for day, or W for week, it will recalculate and understand that. And that works on the risk register as well. So when you can see at the bottom of the screen, I've got a triangular distribution and I've got 15 days, 5 hours, 3 minutes. I mean, of course, depending on your calendars and things, that will probably shape, some rounding up and rounding down. But if you are on a lowest planning unit of minutes, then it won't do any of that, will it? But you have to make sure you're, I guess, what's the word? That they embrace. It's not the word I'm looking for, but they've been set up with this in mind, so they harmonize easily with it. Otherwise, you will experience some rounding up and down type errors, and you can see there that I say error, it's not an error, but it's just rounding up and rounding down. It's just what it is. But that 15 days, 5 hours, 3 minutes will say round to 15.2 days or something like this. This is why I said it was important. So if you set the minimum planning unit to be days, then when you start describing things in minutes and hours, it is going to give you this kind of rounded 15.2 days rather than showing it in the minutes. So that is the obvious consequence of having a minimum planning unit of days, but then describing individual components of your model in minutes or hours. So that's the kind of thing that it will do, and it's particularly important with respect to calendars, because calendars will be set to some planning unit or other, and therefore, you know, you need to make sure these things are all harmonized. So if you're doing a schedule which does need to be calculated all in minutes, just make sure everything, including the calendars, are dealt with in minutes, and they're all understood in that way. Whereas if you're doing a very long 10-year project, days, weeks might be totally sufficient. So, you know, you probably describe things more in that kind of macro language. Otherwise, you start getting this rounding up and rounding down type thing, which might create some kind of distortion. Is if you say that, if you stipulate that the minimum planning unit is days, then the software will always assume that if you type the number 5 into duration without giving it a suffix of minimum of minutes, hours, days, or weeks, it will always just assume you said 5, therefore it must be 5 days. If you then come in and say no, it was 5 and then M, it will auto calculate that as minutes. So if you don't give it a value, it will always assume you meant the minimum value that was stipulated at the creation point of the project. Right, sharing projects. Okay, yeah, so I guess for the eagle-eyed of among you, you may have seen that when we did this screen earlier for schedule, file, export, for the layouts, at the top of that menu was export project. So this is how, if you needed to share the project for any reason, I'm guessing you won't have to because you're probably all going to be on the same server, but if you needed to share it externally, maybe to say us here at Safran, maybe there was an error or something and you needed us to investigate for you, then you could export the project. When you click that button, you get the option there of, do you want it to send it in a Safran project file, or as a primavera.xer, or as a Microsoft project XML. So you get those 3 options again as part of the export process. And if you are sharing the whole project, remembering that it's not just a schedule file, it's the risk model as well. So the risk model is here on the home screen on the sort of black ribbon tab. You've got the import and export risk model. So remembering that risk model is not just the risk register, but it's the global risks, it's the correlations, the mappings, the cost model, all of that other stuff. Okay. So risk register. So we've just kind of moved on to the project risk tab on the black ribbon. Now, in here, you've got the ability to do import export via Excel as previously described. If you do that, then do make sure that you put everything in the correct column, if that makes sense. So like the columns will be formatted in a particular way that Safran, the software, understands it. So if you try to import and export in import in a different order of columns or adding columns and things like it probably won't work. So best thing to do here is create a dummy project or start one off and then Excel export it. And if you want to work inside Excel because you find it faster or more comfortable doing it that way, or maybe you're linking to an ARM database or something like this, then maybe that's the way to do it. And of course, you could then, if that's part of your sort of process, you've got to do this once a month, say, then it might be worth investigating writing a macro or something that will, copy and paste things into the right columns, just as a time-saving device, I suppose. But otherwise, the risk register will remain saved inside the database as you last left it. So if it was a month ago you last ran your Monte Carlo, then the risk register in ARM, say, if you're using a product like that, will have updated over time, whereas this will still be showing what it was last time you ran a Monte Carlo simulation in this product. This database won't have changed. So that's the kind of the interface, I suppose, that you consider doing. Otherwise, I guess you're just doing it manually via the normal kind of mechanism. Right. Global risk. So I talked a little bit about global risk already. So you can see my mouse pointer, I don't know if you can see it wiggling around, but there's the global risk tab. Quite often that's a tab that you won't even have shown. You would go to your options cog and just have it hidden. You wouldn't even use it that often. You might maybe periodically set it up or update it with additional historical actuals, or maybe I was talking to a different customer that they might want to consider using global risks as a means of communication. So you could be in charge of a supply chain where they are doing very detailed bottom-up risk assessments, whereas you as a sort of client organization or project management organization might be looking at the top-down generic assessment of risk. And what you might spot is that as time goes on, there's emergent themes which multiple subcontractors are reporting on. So you might then say, okay, well, 3 out of 10 of the supply chain have noticed this emergent theme, but 7 of them are yet to be made aware of it. So you could create your global risk register as a kind of a communication tool where you then just Excel export the global risk register, make your updates and changes there. Like, I as your client see X, Y, and Z is happening. I think this is the kind of the assessment I would give of this kind of thing. Maybe you could review those global risks at your bottom-up level and reassess them according to the nuance, according to your specifics on your project, because your probability, your impact assessment ranges, your mitigation measures, like proposals, might be different from the ones that we've got in mind. So that helps facilitate good communication, but it's also, as I mentioned, if you've got repeat risks, generic risks, maybe it's, if you're looking at a work winning situation, you don't have much time to start another risk register from scratch. Maybe you want to just bring over generic risks to your next project. This could be a great way of keeping and storing those. But also, as I say, subcontractors, supply chain, if you've got lots of historical performance information, you could use this as a means, a repository of keeping track of that. So there's just a few ideas, and then you can see that it's like a drop-down menu, and then there's a little button to the side of it saying include in the local project level risk register. So that's how I kind of envisage that being used. It's entirely optional, by the way. You don't have to use the global risk register at all. You can just use your project level. Okay. I suppose that the final thing to say about the global risks before I move on is that when you're on that tab on the black ribbon, it looks exactly the same as the risk register. Exactly the same behavior, same data, same fields, same columns. Okay, so the types of risk. So that's the third column along risk type: estimating uncertainty, standard risks, and calendar risks. Those are the 3 different types that you can have. So what we've done with Safran Risk as part of that kind of user interface and simplifying and streamlining the workflow is just to pull together all the risks into one place. And this is how we've done it. So your standard risk event is, a probability of an occurrence, negative impact on your objectives, but it's an uncertain final outcome in terms of the expression of the magnitude or severity of the effect of that risk. Whereas an estimating uncertainty actually has a probability which is kind of anchored in place. It's kind of grayed out. You can see on the screen, roughly in the center of the screen there, 100%. So these are things that we know are going to happen, but we just don't know what that looks like in the future, but we know it will happen. So it's a kind of known unknown. And you can kind of cheese the system. You can game it if you want. You can still put in, like I've got one here, higher order uncertain 10k to 20k units. That's got 100% probability, but it's in as a standard risk. And there's reasons why you might want to do that, such as when you're correlating risks on the correlation matrix, you have to, it won't include estimating uncertainties on the correlation matrix. So if you want to describe something as an estimating uncertainty with 100% occurrence, that would be the way to work around that. Excuse me. And then the final type is the calendar risk. You can see at the very bottom of my register, I've got a kind of a wind speed over 15 meters per second. Maybe you've got tower cranes or something and they can't operate safely for legal reasons when the wind goes above certain speed. So what you'll find, I'm not sure where my slides go with this in a minute, but the wind that's dealt with, you create those calendar risks on the risk calendars tab on the black ribbon, and you can have loads of those and you can share those across your projects as well. But you've got the ability to do that, and it's fairly similar to PRA. However, we've made some advancements and evolved it a bit. You can very easily create a new, say, calendar risk based on actuals. So if you have real life telemetry data from a weather station for, say, 1 year, I'll show you how you can do that, make it last for 10 years for an upcoming project. An evidence-based approach is always good. And then there's a column there called probability in the red box. Red rectangle that's in the center of the screen now. That is what you would describe as the current probability or the pre-mitigated probability. Everyone's going to be different with the semantics on this, but essentially it's different from the post-mitigated position or the kind of forecast position of your risk after you've implemented some mitigation measures. So that's what that is. And then you can see also there's a column with bunches of colors. Those colors will be automatically applied if you add new risks manually inside this system, inside this tool. If you were to add risks via the Excel spreadsheet, however, which I got a feeling you guys might be doing, then you would create your own color inside the Excel spreadsheet, and it would just adopt the color. And if you use the same color for multiple risks, that's possible. So maybe if you're using ARM, say, and it has a probability impact matrix diagram, PID matrix, with greens, yellows, oranges, and red risks, something like that, then you might just want to have some consistency and just show everything that's an amber risk because of other reasons that might not be financial. It could be like a reputational risk makes it red, for instance. You might want to have that sort of distinction. It's up to you how you use it. How we use it in Safran, it's fairly aesthetic. It's not really that important. It has some bearing on one of our outputs on sensitivity analysis, but it's really not the be all and end all. Nothing to really worry about. You don't even have to bother assigning colors if you don't want to. So I wouldn't get too hung up on it. In terms of the distributions that we have inside the tool, we have 9. Most of which you'll probably find most of your user cases in the left hand side there. You've got kind of the uniform, triangle, and beta pert. You'll probably find 80–90% of all your risks will easily be accommodated under those 3 shapes. We do have others, as you can see. Maybe Trigen is going to be useful if you're in a risk workshop and your subject matter experts are telling you one thing, but you're in the room and you can gauge the tone and the mood, and you can maybe smell a bit of BS and you maybe want to adjust it. So you can put some shaping on the extremes of what they are quoting you with the confidence values for a Trigen, and similar on split triangle. But we've also recently added log normal as well, if that's useful to you. If you want me to describe these any more, then just let me know. But what I will say about the discrete and the cumulative that are shown in a kind of more tabular form, you can see there's a button there that says add row. If you click add row, it will let you add up to 100 rows. So if you needed to replicate a different maybe a subcontractor's S-curve from one of their Monte Carlo models, you could do it down to the the P1, the P2, the P3. If you've got the time and energy to do that, you could add 100 rows and replicate their curve perfectly. Other reasons why you might want to use those shapes. I mentioned earlier about scripting and how we've got some advanced functionality, fairly niche. You might want to use a discrete distribution and in conjunction with alternative pathways that you might create. So in terms of your project sequencing, I've got an example that I can show you where I've used scripting to say our customer is going to order, we don't know how many units of our product, and also our customer is global, so they might want us to just ship them down the road by truck. So we'll put in a number of days for doing that. However, they might need us to fly them out to somewhere in Europe. which might then take a lot longer, lots of bureaucracy, red tape, customs, etc. So you might have a scenario where you no longer ship them by truck, but you ship them by air, and you might want to put a probability distribution to determine which action are you going to do, or which activity on your schedule. So you can turn one of them to silent and go turn off, and the other one to sort of have life breathed into it. So you might have heard of this as probabilistic branching or conditional branching. So it's that kind of thing that you can do with those distribution shapes very easily in conjunction with scripting. So if you want to know more about that, I can show you. I guess it's said there in words on the screen, but I've got most of those set to relative. So that means they're shown or described as a percentage increase or decrease on whatever you've mapped it to. So you can do that, but you can also switch it to absolute, which means you can define, like in the top right hand corner, it shows 25% probability of a 20-day impact. So that's an absolute expression. So you can go with probabilities, or sorry, percentages, or absolute cost impact, or absolute duration impact. Okay, so defining your distributions then. So you've got the initial toggles there, which are, is there a schedule impact to this risk, or is there a cost impact to this risk? Choose the shapes, absolute, relative from the drop-down menus, input the 3-point estimates as necessary. And then, as I said, you've also got a post-mitigated position, and you can expand that, and you'll see some additional information. It's basically the same information again, plus some, you've got the option of looking at the activities, the mitigation activities. But you've also got, under this kind of purple section, the mappings. So there's a little summary that this risk is mapped to different parts of the cost model or different parts of the activity schedule. So the cost model being that first one that says additional parts, and you see there's a little circular symbol like a coin. That's the cost model, and all of those other ones are activities. They're kind of Gantt chart bars, as indicated by the little rectangle. There's also a little space at the bottom for freehand text notes if you need to substantiate why you picked up a certain probability or certain range or shape, etc. But we can't ignore this thing here. So this was right at the top, and you might have kind of skipped over it, but there's a little toggle here that can have quite big ramifications on your modeling in terms of the correlation factor. So if you have multiple activities mapped to this, or cost elements as another one, how they behave can be toggled here. So as an example, as you go step through the random iterations 1, 2, and 3 of Monte Carlo, if you do not select that and leave it blank, then that essentially means that every say activity that is mapped to that risk will all suffer the same magnitude, or not at all if the risk does not occur. So you can see here activities A, B, C all suffer 93% impact. Then iteration 2, none of them suffer anything. Iteration 3, they all suffer again, but this time to a new randomly selected 120%. Whereas if you had selected it and allowed them, each of them, to be independently stressed by the Monte Carlo, then A does not, B does, but it's only 90%, whereas C also does, but this time they get 110%, and so forth. So that's the impact that's having on the model. So it's quite important, and it will lead to things like this sort of double hump shape instead of kind of more evenly or uniform distribution, not uniform, but normal distribution type shape. So it's very important to highlight that as part of your modeling. So I mentioned about the post-mitigated position. So once you sort of open that up, you've got the kind of the action toggle. So if you select yes, I'd like to put in some actions, I mean, you don't have to. You could just describe the post-mitigated position without even looking at the actions. But Safran Risk actually has a fairly powerful little feature here, which essentially allows you to add duration activities or cost activities, and then you can sort of describe a mitigation, both in terms of where is that going to be where's the effect of the mitigation measure felt on the model. So you can link that we're going to book a venue for an optioneering presentation that's going to cost us £5,000, but it's also going to take us 2 extra days. It's not part of the original deterministic plan to do this. It's a mitigation proposal. So you say it's going to take 2 extra days on the finalising of the design activity. So you can get a drop down there to map it to the activity. You can also map it to a particular cost breakdown structure element from the cost model as well. And that means that later on, when you run a post-mitigated model, it will incur the cost of 5,000 and 2 extra days in the post-mitigated model. So this allows you to start looking at whether or not it was worth implementing those measures through a few different ways, but principally this kind of cost benefit analysis can be sort of really elevated, I find, if you use this extra toggle here, which says alternate the position based on action. So what happens here is if we select that, you get 2 new or 2-step probability question. First of all, what's the probability that we're even going to execute this mitigation measure? So just because it's been proposed doesn't mean it has to be delivered on. So for instance, a subcontractor can make a proposal, but the client has to accept, may be in a position where they have to fund it or something, and maybe they don't want to. So what you can do there is say, I made a proposal, but it's kind of 50-50. And then even if we did make this proposal and it was executed, maybe it's not proven, therefore it may not succeed. So you can say 80% of the time we think it should succeed, but 20% of the random iterations it won't. And that's exactly what it's doing. Is essentially, if you're running a 5,000, let's say 1,000 iteration model, then this mitigation measure will be implemented, executed 500 times. The other 500 it will not. So 500 times that is a pre-mitigated position. 500 times it'll migrate to a post-mitigated position. But before it can get there, it first has to then answer the second question, which is it successful or not? So of those 500, 80% of those will be successful, and those will move forwards to the post-mitigated situation, but 20% will be kicked right back to the pre-mitigated because it didn't work. So you've incurred the cost of trying to mitigate it, but then not succeeding. So you don't get the reward necessarily. You don't get the benefit of the intended measure. You've got the power to do that, which kind of blends together your pre and your post mitigated in a single model, rather than running an exclusively pre versus exclusively post mitigated. Again, it's entirely optional. I'm not saying you have to do that. It's just there, and I found that as a practitioner a very interesting and welcome additional tool, and you can kind of use it to see the effect of opportunities that, via the sensitivity analysis and things like this, which comes out later on. But by the same token, this is also useful for not just mitigation, but if you're thinking of opportunities, then your pre-mitigated position might look like this. No effort expended, therefore no reward, therefore there's no schedule impact or any cost impact. So 0 probability of opportunities randomly just popping into life and giving us whatever it is we desire and enhancing our objectives. Whereas here, your post-mitigated position, you actually define what the actions look like, how much they're going to cost, and then you can then measure the post-mitigated benefit using that alternate position based on action to understand that payoff. So this is how you would write or define and articulate an opportunity inside the risk register. So when you are defining that distribution shape, you can see at the bottom I've gone with just a triangle. It's relative, but notice that it's all of those 3-point estimates are all below 100%. So that means that there will be most likely a 50% saving on whatever duration of activity that's been mapped to. So if it was a 10-day activity, then the opportunities, it will take 5 days, plus or minus, because you can see I've got a min and a max in there as well. So that's one way of articulating an opportunity. Of course, you could switch it from relative percentage to absolute values in the drop down, and then you could stipulate, no, I want this to be, at least 30 days saved, or most likely 50 days saved, and so forth. So you can, it depends on how you mathematically express it, and then that's how you get an opportunity. So we don't describe things in the risk register as being explicitly threats and opportunities and issues. It depends on how you've expressed them. So I think that the thing I haven't said is that, just in case any of you haven't spotted it and you're kind of going, oh, but where's the risk owner, or where's the mitigation owner? When's the deadline for completing it? That's day-to-day risk management, and that's not the focus of this tool. This tool is all about quantitative analysis, QRA. So it doesn't really concern itself with all of those other things, because once you get into that kind of Pandora's box of how do you best manage risk, that's a much broader topic with arms and legs, and it walks off the table. Everyone else has got their own opinions on how to do that. So the user interface here has been very much streamlined when it comes to the risk register to just talk about what's the bare bones minimum that people need to be able to do sensible, decision making on cost benefit analysis and things like that through the means of quantitative sort of analysis. So we do have another tool in production at the moment, or we just concluded the second round of beta testing, called Safran Risk Manager. So that's not the topic of today's training, but just for your awareness, we have that coming out towards the end of this year. And there will be future integration with that tool, kind of compatibility and so forth, where you can then express your risk register in terms of reputational impact and all those other kind of things that you might do in an ARM database, for instance. But we've got a different vision for what we want our product to be and how it works. And if you want to know more about it, I guess speak to me outside of the training, and I can talk a little bit more if you prefer, if you're interested. But I'm very much into the realm of looking at complexity science and understanding how risk in the future is going to be done differently. In my personal belief, we'll be looking at relationships between things and such. So that requires different tools to the ones that we've been using thus far, which are frankly inadequate. But anyway, that's a completely different topic. So risk calendars then. So this is a screenshot from a different tab on the black ribbon. Again, this is one of the ones that you probably will hide most of the time, but occasionally you want to create one of these calendar risks and have it as something you can select on your risk register. So for anyone that's done calendar risks in the past, then in PRA or PERTmaster, this will be fairly familiar. Perhaps this, I'm not sure, I can't quite remember how it looked, but I think the visual feedback here is quite nice, that you can select your distribution shapes and you can see, like in this purple distribution shape, how that is being interpreted by the software. So it just gives you that extra sort of validation comfort, I suppose. But the three different types, broadly speaking, are the periods of blocks of downtime, the weather windows of downtime. I keep saying weather. A calendar risk doesn't need to be about weather. It really does not. But it just so happens that it's a really easy way to explain the concept. So I might slip by talking about weather quite a lot. And then the other one is periods of probability of downtime. So you can assign individual periods a probability value, and it will just express that during the Monte Carlo. But the first type, period of blocks, you've got two variables essentially. So you create a period of time that you're interested in, and then so I'm going with the example of a storm season. So maybe it's how many storms do you typically experience within an annual storm season, and you might express that as 1, 2, and 10 using a beta PERT distribution, something like this. So it's most likely to be 1 or 2 or 3, maybe not so much towards the 10, but 10's possible, it's plausible. And then the second question from this column is number of blocks. So this means how many days worth of downtime would you get if a storm was to occur. So again, that can be an uncertainty distribution of between, we've gone with 0, 1, and 3 days. So your storm might give you downtime of up to 3 days if it's particularly severe. So it's two different questions, both being probabilistically analysed there. The second type is the window of downtime. So this is where you're expecting something annually, perhaps, or maybe just in one particular year, and you're expecting it to cause downtime on your working. So it could start early as, or most likely as, or late as and then you just describe and articulate the end time of the period, which again is also an uncertainty. So effectively 3-point distributions on start and end date of a particularly large or long lasting event. Clearly you can just add as many of those as you need as necessary. And then the final type that we mentioned here was that you could sort of just go, I'm guessing that the period of this time here, which is the beginning of January to the end of January, 25%, and you just going with gut feel perhaps. But that's where, if you're into the realm of what you might describe as continuous data, then if you happen to have it, then why not use it? Why not use a real life example? So you actually find this under the sample data, which I mentioned at the very start from the burger menu. Go to the open the log file folder. We've got some sample data there, some sample projects. This spreadsheet's in there. But what you can do with this is if you've got the actual real life telemetry from a weather station, for instance, wave height, wind speed, and these kinds of things, just add a column and then, you know, put in a formula that says if greater than X, then 1, if not, then 0. And just that simple logic 1, logic 0 is enough information. If you were to copy and paste just those 2 columns, the time stamp or time period as it's called there, and was there downtime, yes or no, just copy and paste those 2 columns directly into Safran Risk, it will create a Monte Carlo, a weather calendar for you. And the reason I say Monte Carlo it for you is, I don't know if you can see in the bottom right of the screen, it says length 10 years. What if that sample was 1 year's worth of data? Well, here you can extrapolate it and it will use this as the inspiration, and then it will Monte Carlo put some natural variation on that so that it is can be recycled and reused for the next 10 years or the next 10 years worth of different projects. So, you know, your central office could create that for one geographic area like London, or if you were doing oil rigs out in the sea, you know, the particular area, then it'd be pertinent for that, and you'd be able to share that for any project that's in that same geographic area. So it's just worth pointing that out. It's quite a neat function. So the real-time analyzer. So this thing here, this screenshot is actually coming from the risk mapping screen. I'm actually going to come out of the slides because I think this is going to be better served if we're actually inside the tool itself. Let's see, risk mappings. Okay, so at the moment I've got this set. So we already kind of saw a sneak peek of it when we were doing the filtering and the layouts and we were changing it, but I've got it set at the moment, so it's work breakdown structure. Okay, so you've got our prelims, design, fabricating, constructing, testing, and then final testing and handover. So it's a very simple project. So it's barely 30 activities, I think, in this schedule. And then you've got your risk register shown across the top, including kind of the weather downtime risk, as described a moment ago. We've got some low, medium, and high estimating uncertainties. So just to give that a little bit more colouring, you know, my low estimating uncertainties are just beta PERT distributions, plus or minus 5%, very natural variation on, you know, routinely done tasks. So high levels of confidence, but low and therefore low uncertainty. Okay, I mean, you might then, as part of medium uncertainty, move to a triangle shape where you're starting to send more of the random iterations towards the extremes. You can also start playing with, you know, the extremes, so they're no longer symmetrical, they're more skewed. And then finally, with our high, for demonstration purposes, I've just gone with a uniform. So maybe this is for an activity sometime in the future. It's like 4 years into the future. We have no idea. We're not arrogant enough to know what the most likely is going to be. So we've got an idea. It's in the schedule as part of the deterministic program, but we're going to plus or minus that by 20%. Could be, you know, quicker, delivered sooner than, but maybe 50% overrun potential. So that's broadly what I've got going on in the background here, just for your information. And then when you come to mapping, you can see that I've got my low, medium, and high. They are on the left hand side of this kind of solid grey line, so it just helps organize the information a little bit better, but it's also going back to one of the points I made very early on, that someone asked, can you edit the 3-point estimates in the schedule? So I said the answer was yes, and I also said that that was kind of like the traditional method, but that if you were on a project like my last one with tens of thousands of line items, that we just don't have time to create a 3-point estimate for each individual line item. So this is where this method comes into its own, because it means that you can open up, say, construction phase and say, actually, everything's going to be done in a factory. It's going to be low uncertainty, therefore. So I'm going to click on the construction phase on that node to low, and all 3 of the child elements beneath it snap automatically to that. I might then reconsider and maybe do a workshop with my team, and then they say, oh, wait a minute, no, connecting fuel and engine systems, that's sadly kind of tricky. That maybe is more in the high zone. We're not so sure. So you've got the ability to very easily cascade the effect of one risk or one uncertainty range to many things underneath a work breakdown structure, or it could be by subcontractor or whatever it might be. So it's very intuitive and easy to do, and very visual, so people can see what's going on screen quite easily as well. And as we start, if we go to, say, the one that I like to use is locating subcontractors and suppliers. So I've got this here showing the schedule impact, and I've got the duration uncertainty is high. I've got external communication risk, 40% probability in this shape distribution. I've got design spec change, internal communication issues. I can scroll along. I've got even one more risk here, subcontractor liquidation, low probability, 5%. So all of those things there then compound together on the bottom right of this screen to show me that what we call the real-time analyzer. So this is a 1000 iteration Monte Carlo, and it's showing me the black line is my deterministic. So this should be a 40-day long activity, but it could be as low as 32 days or as much as 97 days. And I've got the mean of that shown as 52. Here's the power, is that as I start adding new risks, you can see in real time that reruns 1000 iterations instantly. And then you can see that that's changed the shape. Well, maybe not so much the shape, but it's extended the worst case, and also the minimum best kind of outcome has also been truncated somewhat as well. So you get that real sense with your team of how are the way we are building the model, how is that really having an effect, and you get that kind of instantaneous feedback. So, you know, other things might be, or an example might be, if your activity only has 3 days deterministic, but you witness 7 months worth of impact, that would be an anomaly that would flag up before you run the model. So that means your team would spot it, hopefully, as part of the kind of the creation process, and you would have more confidence that once you have run the model together, that because you've gone through this kind of process of validating the shape and that, you know, just saying, does that feel right? You know, just my intuition, my gut feel, does this work? Is it realistic? So as you do that, it means that you trust the output when you finally come to running the full Monte Carlo later, is what my pitch and my belief is on this. It's definitely as a sort of practicing risk manager, it's my favorite part of the whole tool. It's because it's clearly designed for collaboration in mind, and it's because it's so visual, and hopefully, you know, we're all doing virtual streaming, you know, screen sharing at the moment, so this can still work really well for you and your teams at the moment, even with lockdowns and things like that. If you click on this little subtab here for the risk, then you can actually see the impact distributions and probabilities and things that were defined on the risk register. You've got the ability to click override. So let's say locating subcontractor supplier. So that's an external communication issue, and lo and behold, we've got an external communication risk on our register. We might then decide as a team that the subject matter expert's description of the impact scenario is not adequate for this particular activity in the schedule. Maybe this activity is way more sensitive, so you'd click the override button. Maybe you would change the probability, maybe not. Maybe you would change the distribution shape and got maybe a different shape entirely. It could be any of the 9 But that's the point, is that you can say, well, no, this is more sensitive. So the other activities may suffer to this amount, but this activity would suffer more, or maybe less. Maybe it's more robust, more resilient. So you've got that ability to finesse the model behavior with the override button. And for those that were sort of heavy users of PertMaster, PRA, that do these impact in series or in parallel is a very relevant question. So if we take the example of what we got here, we got 97-day impact. You could have been in a situation where these were all switched to in series, so the impacts accumulate one on top of the other if they happen to randomly occur at the same time. If you now click on the schedule impact, that's doubled. Yeah, you can see 199 days is now the worst case sampled by 1,000 iterations. So do these things impact in series or parallel? How does that look in terms of how will that affect the model? Now I can see very quickly and easily without having to rerun it. I don't have to make any new files. I don't have to risk impact a schedule and create pre-input and all that kind of stuff. So it's very intuitive and easy to do in here. So if you want to go with the more traditional method, then if you click in the options cog, so the options, as I said, the cogs are sensitive to whatever screen you're on. So here I've only got options for this screen. And if I could change estimating uncertainty from using the risks from the risk register to use activity uncertainty, the view will change. And now I've got my distribution min, likely, max. So if you want to have this as your approach, you're free to do so. I would just point out that under the current version of the software, you can't edit the 30-day, 90-day, 150-day, or the shape distribution here. You would have to go back to the schedule tab itself and make those edits here. Okay, but when you're on the risk mapping screen, what you choose here as your option tells the Monte Carlo what to use as the input value. So if I have it set like this, it uses this. If I change it back to the risk register, it now uses the risk register items, these low, medium, and highs. It's one or the other. I think the development team might be working on a kind of blended approach where you can choose on a per activity basis, but for the moment, this is how it works and behaves. So it's just important to sort of make that clear. You may also notice under the options cog that you've got a kind of which mitigation position are you looking at, pre or post and such, because you might find that a risk mapping breaks depending on the mitigation position, pre or post. So you could have scenarios where there is no mapping, for instance. So there is a button at the top here that says convert uncertainty, so I should probably just explain that before moving on. So the schedule has 3-point estimate or some 3-point estimates, and if you click that button, maybe you want to use the information that's already provided and you don't want to lose it, but you do want to migrate and evolve towards using this method here with the risk register. So if you click that button, it will detect what it can find in terms of estimates and shapes, and if you hit this button, create risks, it will then add those to the risk register and then automatically map them, which then allows you to continue using this kind of evolved practice rather than sticking with the traditional. So you get kind of the best of both worlds, I suppose, if you to do that. So which is, if you were to click, say, on weather downtime risk in the top right, if I click on that, it filters to show me only the items where that risk has been mapped and applied. So you can see the ticks are over here. So I can have a quick glance at that. In flight, final on-site testing. That's also going to be flying these drones, that unmanned aerial flying vehicles on a disused airfield somewhere. So that weather risk will definitely affect probably just these things, because everything else is indoors. It's just design activities and it's manufacturing indoors, but test flying, definitely a weather risk. So it's a very easy, straightforward way to see at a glance where you've mapped the risks, which I quite like as well. And similarly, if you were to scroll along the top here, so this is the total project. You can see that there's a blank square there. Someone might then go, oh, hang on, you've not mapped a risk. Is that intentional? or is that an accident? Should that have a mapping? And you go, oh, all right, fair enough. You come down here and you create the mapping that it should have had. So little things like that just helps validate the model a little further. Okay, I realised actually that my slides didn't really go into any detail on the schedule warning, so we should probably just rewind slightly to that. I mean, I did say that this tab was automatic in terms of its detection of issues, and the issues that it's looking for are broadly in line and same as the ones done by OPRA. So if you click the options cog, you can select which ones to check for, and these are broadly the same ones that OPRA was looking at in terms of constraints, lags, and relationships, you know, predecessors and such. The only one of these at the moment that can be changed is this percentage of lags. So if you make that 20%, because it's dynamic and automatic, though that threshold's no longer been breached by 2 of them, so that's now dropped off the report. And if I put it back to 10%, they come back. But how you use this report, you've got a hyperlink in here, so you want to drill down, go back to the schedule, it will take you straight back to that item. It describes what the problem is that's, you know, worthy of your consideration. You then have an option to accept or reject, I guess. By not accepting, you're rejecting, so that you can facilitate a bit of communication. Now, who you're communicating to is a very valid question. So I envisage at least 2 scenarios for this. One is you don't have the time to send this back to the schedulers. Maybe you would like the schedulers to make all these amendments on the actual schedule itself, but maybe there's just no time. So you have to make all the edits yourself directly in Safran Risk, which you're fully able to do on the schedule tab. However, what you might want to do, just to help memorize what it was that you did and why you did it, you can just freehand text, add in some notes. I am going to make this change for these reasons. And then as you build up that report, you can then hit the export, hit to Excel, and then you can attach that as an appendix to a future QSRA report that you draft, without having to double handle the what did I do, what were the caveats, what were the changes I made to the model, sorry, to the schedule file that I actually received. So this will help with that discussion in that way. Alternatively, it is the no, I do have time to wait. I'm going to describe all the problems, why they're problems, and why I want the scheduler to make those fixes on my behalf. So you then describe what it is you want them to do before you accept it, and then you hit export and email it off to them. So those are the 2 broad cases for how you might use this. But is there any, I think it does pretty much what it says on the tin, and this is an area that will receive some development, and it will, you know, be enhanced in the coming year. I highly suspect, I did hear my Chief Technology Officer just before I came on this call describing that this is something they're definitely prioritising to improve, but this is how it is at the moment, and I believe it's comparable, if not slightly better than the one that was in PRA. Just for the avoidance of doubt, if you start making the changes and fixing things, then this little schedule warnings thing will drop down. It'll go from 2 to 1, and it will drop off the list entirely. It will disappear, and that's why I said make the notes first, export it, then make the changes, because otherwise you lose that you know, that audit log, I suppose, of all the things that you've done, all the good stuff that you've done to improve the model to make it fit for purpose, because clearly you can't run a QSRA with lots of say constraints and things. It will tend to skew the outcomes. Okay, I think we'll be, so we talked about project risks, we talked about risk mapping just then. Cost, I think I'm going to dip back to the slides for this because it will probably do a slightly better job. So modeling, okay, so when you're modeling costs, you've got 2 approaches, a kind of A or a B, as I've sort of just described here. So method A, again, this is kind of more the traditional, maybe what you've used to been doing in the past, where you have a cost or resource loaded schedule. Now, that's perfectly fine. We accept that, and you can model that as necessary if that's what you want to continue doing. We do, however, offer alternative, which is method B, which is there's a cost tab or module where you can articulate and define your own cost breakdown structure. And anecdotally, I prefer method B to method A. I think method A, I rarely, if ever, saw done in any of the projects in my career, because it seems to be such a large undertaking for the schedulers in conjunction with the cost estimators, and to do it right and to try and make some maybe square costs fit into round scheduling holes. It doesn't quite work for them all the time, so it's very difficult to do. So when I came across Safran Risk as part of my trialing on my last project, and I discovered that this kind of ability to make a cost breakdown structure and then pro rata and apportion costs to certain activities in a different way, it was very intuitive and very easy to do. So I do prefer method B, but you've got the option of going with method A. What you can't really do at this point is both. You have to kind of define as part of your risk management plan, are you going to go with method A or B? I wouldn't recommend attempting to do both, but you could probably cherry pick some elements. But yeah, broadly, when you're looking at the outputs, so when it comes to some Monte Carlo S-curves, histograms like this, you'll see there's a very obvious step in choosing what it is you're looking at. So if you're using method A, then you can see the red hoop on the schedule button of the histogram. So this means that you can see the finish date, the start date, duration, and then I've just circled in red hoop at the bottom cost. So these are the costs associated with that particular activity or schedule, and it's not using or being influenced whatsoever by anything you put in the cost breakdown structure. So it's only cost loaded and resource loaded type elements, or maybe risks from the risk register that have cost. That's all you're getting with method A in that output. Whereas if you click on B, you've got the blue hoop with the cost. Now you can see that this portion of the screen, which was previously the hierarchy tree of the schedule, is now the cost breakdown tree hierarchy instead. So you get a completely different view and focus area of those. So very important distinction that I have to make for you all to understand. If I've not made that clear, or you're still a bit confused, please ask or ask after the training. Okay, so on the black ribbon on the cost tab, so this is what we sometimes call the cost module, you can articulate the cost breakdown structure. So how do we do that? This button here, grouping, this is where you create your outline structure for your CBS, and you can manually do that in here in the grouping button, and in there you could, I'm not aware of any limitations on how deep the hierarchy tree is that you create, and you can assign coloration and things to the the different nodes and things in there. So I've mentioned the import export button. Okay, so once you've created your CBS, any node that you've then selected, if you then hit the add cost button, it will then insert a new cost element underneath that node on your CBS. You can see that I've got a very simple one on screen there with materials, labour, other, and underneath materials you can see I've got sand, wood, concrete, mortar, etc. So that's how you add individual cost elements or line items. And you can probably see underneath that there's a whole bunch of information which we'll go through in a moment. But there's a button there that says regroup, and I was confused initially as to what that was doing, but apparently this is something to do with the database. Sometimes if you copy and paste or maybe drag and drop a cost element because you added it under materials, but really it should have been under labor, sometimes the database doesn't re-render the screen correctly, or you come back to it and you can't see something that you previously added. If you hit the regroup button, it kind of forces a refresh of the screen, and it's just an issue that we seem to have with this one particular tab in the tool. So I guess my advice is, if you can help it, but avoid using the drag and drop altogether, and just add a new item and delete the other one if it's in the wrong place, is my recommendation, and then you shouldn't experience that problem. But if you do, for whatever reason, then just hit regroup, should sort you out. If it doesn't, then talk to our support team with the Safran @support email. So this last one here is the variables. Now, this is the thing for me that brings Safran Risk closer in terms of capability with something like at risk, if you've ever used that, or model risk, or any of the other Excel spreadsheet based approaches to doing Monte Carlo. So this allows you to define something that in itself has an uncertainty distribution, which when you map it to other things in your cost model, it will cascade the effect of that variable from like a central place across the whole model, or at least the cost model. So as I said, this is the thing that, you know, it can govern and shape different what if scenarios and things like that. It just gives you a way of playing with your model and trying to probe it and understand the way it works. Or I think we'll show some examples later where I've got what if delay penalties, things like that. So you can do all kinds of things, which I'll get to. So I guess one of the main reasons you're here is you've probably done cost modeling, Monte Carlo modeling somewhere, and you've probably done schedule risk modeling somewhere, but you maybe have seldom ever linked both holistically in the same model. So these next few slides are going to try to attempt to explain that. But before I do, I might come out and just go into the tool itself for a moment, because I think we should probably spend some time on the columns and what they're doing. So, okay, so on screen, I've got my cost breakdown structure. I've got some materials and other costs and things. Okay, so you can choose what columns are on display with this little button in the top left corner. If you click that, I can take ID off, for instance, and then I've got my base price. And I can stipulate, you know, a value, £240 or £170. I can then also articulate an uncertainty distribution using any of the 9 shapes that you saw earlier, and whether that's going to be absolute values or relative percentages. And I've then got the same ability to put in the quantity and an uncertainty on the quantity. So you've got price uncertainty and quantity uncertainty, and it will summarize the kind of deterministic position here in the base times quantity column and give you the total project costs. And so it's showing 10.99 million over here. So that's our deterministic position. Clearly this is going to get Monte Carlo'd and stressed by various factors later, but it's building up a picture down below in the histogram. So the portion that is shown up as amber or orange in the histogram at the bottom there is the bit that's selected from the model. So that's the total labor costs from the node. If I click PMO and click on time this time, that's the proportion of that cost element, design house. So you can sort of easily quickly see how much of a, I guess, impact that is. And this is just the deterministic cost, by the way, so this has nothing to do with Monte Carlo yet. If we were to run Monte Carlo with the step through on, then this would move around. You would see that sort of changing. But you've got these columns then, so you've got your base price and uncertainty, quantity, uncertainty, etc. Then you move into the schedule connection and how that works. And then you finally got the risk register items. So you can sort of click in here and then select from the risk register which risks would apply. So this is another mapping screen, but this time for cost, where there's a cost impact rather than a schedule impact. And what you're getting, you might recall that our risk register was maybe 14 or so risks long, but I'm only seeing about 4 or so in here. But that's because I'm only seeing the risks that have a cost impact. So it's truncating the view of the whole risk register. There's another column that you can't see, which is on the very far right hand side, but it only shows up during the step through analysis, which gives you the kind of what was the iteration cost, excuse me, for each line item as you step through the Monte Carlo. So that's the kind of broad overview of the cost model. But just to explain this cost connection, then linking cost to time. So first of all, you need to hit this button here. There's a toggle for schedule connection. And when you open up that when you click on the activity to select the activity, you can select one activity or one hammock or multiple activities. And what you'll be forced to do at that point is it will default to say that 100% of all the costs are going to be against the first initial activity. So, and it will then put 0% to every subsequent activity. So it kind of forces you to think, you know, how do I pro rata and spread that cost around? And then as you do that, and once you've done that, you can see on the sort of right hand side that these then auto calculate a proportion based, or a day rate based on the duration divided by however much was assigned to each of them. Now, for everything that is not been assigned, because you can assign up to 100% maximum value, but for everything that you don't assign, it ends up here in the fixed column. So in this particular example, you can see that the time independent cost is 0, because actually 25% plus 20 plus 25 plus 10 plus 20 adds up to 100. So I actually apportioned all of the design house costs to those activities. So, but in the line item above that says PMO, and I've got a sort of beta PERT distribution, but you can see here that I've given it to a hammock which lasts for the duration of the whole project, and I've then assigned 80% of the cost to be variable. So that you can see that 20% therefore is landing here in the time independent. So there's a fixed upfront cost of 400 grand that is just spent, and it's not going to change, but the 1.6 is variable. It's that variable portion that is used as part of the auto calculation for the day rate. So 1.6 million divided by the 530 days deterministic duration of the hammock, which is the whole length of the project, and then you get £3,000 per day, or £3,019 per day. So that means that as you Monte Carlo this, for every day beyond 530 days, it's going to cost the project an extra £3,000 per day. But if there was opportunities and you come in at maybe one day early, you'll save £3,000 for that day. So that's broadly how that is working out and calculating. So you've got kind of time independent and time dependent cost. And it's probably the easiest way of doing it, and doing it very quickly. I found it quite intuitive to do when I first came across this. So I mean, anecdotally, I wandered over to the cost estimator's desk, and they had a very high level cost breakdown structure, which I was able to manually recreate in Safran within 20 minutes or so. And then I began proportioning and prorating different things with no particular, knowledge necessarily, but I was able to take a very good guess with my understanding of the project as I did, and then start running Monte Carlo with a fully integrated model, and then generating insights of where is cost really coming from on this project when schedule drives additional cost and such like. Incidentally, as a bit of an aside, you can actually have it the other way. Your cost model through correlation can actually drive the schedule as well. It goes both ways, which is something I have tested, and it does work. So I think we've covered that. It can't total greater than 100% of what's available, and anything less counts as fixed, so that's good. Right, when in time are costs incurred? So if you use the method shown, pretty much it will default to using the activities you've assigned it to. So that histogram at the bottom of the orange portion is showing you that the design house is here in time, because you can see there's another toggle at the bottom of the screen that says use dates from activities in the schedule connection. This here is the schedule connection. So if you toggled that on, then that's easy, and it just automatically calculates, and that's the default. However, you can override it. You could untoggle that and then click one of these buttons here that says fix the date in time. So maybe there's an upfront point in time when you're going to purchase that really expensive piece of equipment. It's like a non-negotiable. It's just going to happen. There's nothing that's going to stop it. It won't move around in time depending on other factors on the project. So if you're that confident, you could fix it in place. Alternatively, you can stipulate when in time the cost will be incurred, but according to a different activity to the ones that you've made the connection on. So maybe there's something else that is driving the when in time. So maybe there's a payment milestone you want to link it to, or something like that. I'm not sure. It's entirely up to you, but you've got the freedom to kind of decouple or delink these things. So it's I guess it's something I would encourage you to play with. So you open up some of those demo files and just run the Monte Carlo, see what it does, then come back here, change some of the settings, change where you've linked it or fixing it in time, and see how that affects where the spread of cost goes. It's worth pointing out though at the bottom of the screen that just says cost elements. They'll actually default to inherit whatever instruction you've given them from the parent node on the cost breakdown structure. So what I mean by that is you can click on the parent node and say when in time will all materials be purchased, and you can say, well, they'll be purchased in March next year, and that's it. And then any cost element you have underneath the materials bar or node will automatically inherit that unless you put a schedule connection in, which will then potentially overwrite that. So there is other sort of default things that will go on in the background as well. So I've mentioned already that this will move around with the step through, but if you're interested in what's called probabilistic cash flow, there is a separate output on the black ribbon on the right hand side called PCF, probabilistic cash flow, which will give you the Monte Carlo, or I guess you might call it the risk adjusted cost position or cash flow, rather than the deterministic. So what you see on screen is deterministic, but once you've run a Monte Carlo, maybe you want to see a P80 position instead of that, because you know it's going to move. So if you want to see where the peaks and troughs of expenditure are going to be, or how high are the peaks after the deterministic end date, you know, how long is the project going to run for, and what does that look like each month, you can do that. But there's an example here where actually, if you click on a cost element, there's a sub tab at the bottom of the screen. It says base calculation there. I think this is an older screenshot. This definitely says formula now, I'm sure of it. And the formula allows you to create a base price or a quantity based on whatever you write in the formula. And to do, let's actually dip into the tool. This will be a little easier, more intuitive for you. Let's find that same one, legal costs. Right, so if I go to, yeah, it's called formulas under the latest version. So you can see here, I've got a kind of, I'm going to call this, it says the references, but I think of this more as like a menu or ingredients list. And then you create those in here, and then you create a symbol. So this is what I want them to be referred to as under the formula. So I've got this kind of legal cost from my variable table, which is a triangular distribution with a most likely of £5,000 per day. I then call it legal F as the symbol. If I call that legal fees, it breaks the formula as I've written it, because legal F is no longer recognized. So this is just a bit of validation to help you understand if what's working, what's not working. If it accepts it, it then changes the color of it to help you track and understand this. So I've got legal fees of 5,000 a day, could be a bit more, could be a bit less, multiplied by open brackets, activity reference AO 110, and the duration thereof. So you can see here that I've linked in from the activity selection, so I could have picked any activity from the selection there. And it's got a duration or deterministic duration of 8 days. So that's creating a 5,000 per day multiplied by 8, so that's 40,000. But then my formula says then add 10 more £1,000 for disbursement fees. So that gives you a grand total of 50 grand. You can see up here it's written that in 50 grand and it's grayed out. So I can't actually edit that 50 grand. I can edit it down here in the formula. I can put and £1 more, and it's now 50,001. So that's how you can also create like a schedule connection or a time dependent connection of cost. Yes, like the £10,000 is always going to be £10,000, but the duration may stretch or shrink, and therefore the legal fee, which might also be higher or lower than £5,000 depending on the Monte Carlo sampling. So there's a lot going on there, and you've got a lot of finesse, a lot of control, and you could do something similar with the quantity as well if the quantities are uncertain. I should probably open up the variables table just so you can see what's going on in there. If you click on that, I mentioned that you can do kind of what if scenarios and things like that. I mean, I've got let's have a look. We got the legal costs we just talked about a moment ago. £5,000 a day is the base price, and then I've described it here as a triangle. Other distributions are available, of course. Maybe it's a financial year uplift, and then I use the formulas to link and say if this happens, or if this threshold or trigger is met, then randomly select a percentage to increase the costs by. So it could be 3%, 4%, or 10%, and I've created a probabilistic chance that it will be any of those three outcomes. So these are kind of simple what if scenarios that you could test in the cost model, and then send the output through to your distribution comparison for later, comparing against other scenarios and things. And I did also mention earlier about penalty fees. So here's an example. Best guess penalty fees. We know we're going to have them. We've had them in the past with our customers, but we haven't entered into contract yet, so we don't know what they're going to be. We can guess what they're going to be. So we've created a variable which says it could be £100 a day, it could be £2,500 a day. We're not really sure. But here's the formula. So you describe the you know, in the kind of the menu, the ingredients list, the things that are in question, you add them in here. So I'm looking now at this particular activity dot early finish. If that early finish exceeds this date, then start applying this or multiplying by that delay penalty. And furthermore, I've done something here with the quantity formula that says, and if I go into the following financial year, double the delay penalty. And what we can do with our scatter plot as an output is just check and see if that formula is even working and behaving. So that's something that can be done. So I'm just going to move things on a bit because I can see the time's getting on for nearly 4 o'clock and we haven't even run a Monte Carlo yet. But we've pretty much gone through all of the input tabs apart from correlation. If you want me to, I will do that. But just while we're talking about correlation, there's a little toggle here on the options. You can include the matrix or not. Again, a soft what if analysis or comparison between whether you got them on or off. You may be of interest to you. But the principal things you're going to be doing in this screen is selecting which elements from your risk register are or are not included in the simulation, whether they're going to be at pre-mitigated or post-mitigated positions or a blend therein or thereof. So that could be useful to you. The grey boxes that are around some of those risks, notice this is the opportunity that we got, design specification we looked at on one of the slides earlier, which was where we had the mitigation with the optioneering presentation, but we had it as an alternate position based on action. So these 3 grey boxes represent all of those places where the mitigation measure drives if it is a pre or it is a post mitigated position. So if I don't want to see a grey box there, I'll have to go back to the risk register and untoggle that. I've then got how many thousands of iterations, whether I want to use convergence thresholds, and I can set those. Whether to anchor around a certain seed value, use Latin hypercube, include correlation matrix on or off, resource leveling after each iteration if you have a resource loaded schedule, and of course the step through, which we'll definitely be doing. So those are all the things that are in play, but before I hit go and run the analysis, I just explain the focus activities and costs. This allows you, this is very relevant to me on my last project where, let's say I had my 16,000 schedule, the contract had 70 key date milestones which were contractual, and then of those 70, maybe 20 of them were tangibly important or agreed as the most important ones. So I might want to create a little short list of those milestones, of those 20 in here, without having to memorize all of the ID numbers and references from the schedule itself. This creates a little short list, which means later on when you explore, it's easier to track. Maybe do it as a workshop, and everyone can sort of slickly see you navigating between the objectives that matter, rather than drilling down various hierarchy trees and trying to find the ones in question. And once you've selected all the things that are important to you, then you're going to hit your analysis, and this will be fairly familiar territory to you with respect to hitting the next step and then being able to see the Monte Carlo have an effect on the schedule. What I've done with this layout is that I've anchored in place with this kind of grey bar the deterministic schedule, so I can see just how much of an effect the Monte Carlo or the risks are actually having against that. And I've also created a computed field which is displaying in the yellow triangle. So not only does it show me which risks are impacting on each given iteration, it's showing me how much by, what's the delta. So if there's opportunities like this, it'll come up as -24 and so forth, and if there are risks, there'd be big impacts potentially. So this is useful in helping you understand the behavior of your model and if it's working the way you intended. I won't really sort of labour the point, but what I will do is I just quickly go into the cost model just to show you that this is all happening here too. So if I was to go to, say, I don't know, material cost, no, other labour, there you are, labour costs. So if you want to see where labour costs are being spent or incurred as part of the step-through analysis and how much by, you can see that that all moves around as well. And if you scroll this over to the right, wherever the risks have been mapped, you can see those lighting up and changing as well. So all the various details and then the final iteration value. So this is all, again, doing exactly the same thing to help you understand whether or not it's behaving as you intended. And once you're satisfied that the schedule and the cost model are doing what you need them to, and I should also point out that you could just run the cost model without a schedule. You don't have to always have a schedule there. You could just run this with cost. Once you're happy, hit complete. And it'll take you straight to your first sort of default output, which should be the histogram and S-curve. Sometimes it goes into the raw data view if you left that up last time you were there. So familiar territory for most of you with a Monte Carlo background. I mentioned that you've got your finish date, start date, duration, cost, outputs from the schedule. You want to see the cost module or cost breakdown structure, click on this button and look at labour costs or look at whatever it is, PMO, design house. So you can drill down as necessary into either of those elements. You can set targets, which will draw a new arrow on the graph and add it into the statistics window on the right hand side. So we can see things like we've got the deterministic 280,000, the probability of achieving that is P32 and so forth. So there's all the sort of usual things there. But what I quite like is that this is all fairly interactive in terms of the legend. So you don't like the colours, obviously go with different colours. You can change those under the options cog, no problem with that. But what you can do is if you don't want to see the histogram, just untoggle it from the legend. So you can layer on as many of these things as you like. The big colourful blocks in the background are what we call curtains. So you define under the options cog what are the percentiles, the focus percentiles that you're interested in. Is it P50 or P75 or whatever it might be? And then once you've defined those, you can then draw curtains to show the calculation of between the delta between the deterministic to P50, P50 to P80, P80, P90 and so forth. So that might be the subcontractors proportion of the contingency. This might be the project managers, that might be the overall client. You know, that could be a user case for that kind of thing. But you can set as many focus percentiles as you like. So I've got P1 and P100 because I'm actually interested in looking at the overall volatility sometimes between models and on risks and things. But I guess I'll let you explore that for yourselves in terms of what you can do, but most of it is to do with, you know, color and what you see and what you don't see. And you've got the curtains here and just hit the add button and you can sort of draw in as many as you need. If you hit the export button, you're pretty much going to get either just the graph or graph and the table or the raw data and the percentiles. So you've got a few different options there. If you want to see raw data, not in an Excel spreadsheet, but in another way, we have this button here for the data view, which gives you every single iteration. So I've run 2000 iterations. Here they all are. Finish dates, start dates, duration. That is the cost embedded within the schedule. So if you want to see the cost, you'd have to click on the cost tab again, and then you get the actual CBS, and you can see this breakdown structure has changed one more time. So you can actually click on any particular part of that breakdown structure and look at just those things and see how things did or did not affect those. I'm just going to go back to the schedule though, because what you can do in here is pretty neat. You can, let's say, resort by shortest duration. So you click here. So you might recall we had 530 days deterministic. So the best out of 2,000 iterations that we ever had was 552 days. If you want to see what that looks like, you can actually hyperlink in and click and see that version of the step through. You can see here that virtually no risks happened, and the ones that did happen weren't to a terribly severe magnitude. If you scroll around and down, you'll find red boxes for risk, green boxes for opportunities. Like there's a green one. Hover over, get the schedule impact, so you can understand what did and didn't happen. But what's more interesting to me personally is if I resort to the other end of the spectrum. So I'm now up at the double the deterministic. So the deterministic is virtually got doubled to about 1,000 or more days. I can see what conspired together to create that worst case scenario, or this P100 type scenario. I can see also, as I scroll down and I look, what squares or which risks fired on or tend to fire on during worst case scenarios. So this gives me some indication as to what might be typically at play in a bad day at the office. It can lead to more questions like, how do I make these particular combinations of risks not occur at the same time? You know, talking about that complexity theory, you know, again, like how do you decouple things, remove their kind of cascade or domino effect between one another? So, you know, opens up new avenues of investigation. But just so you can see it, if I click that iteration hyperlink, what does the baddest day in the office look like? It's this one here. There's my deterministic, there's my P80 risk adjusted, and there on the far right is just how bad it could have got. And that as a visualization might be super helpful when you want to just focus the minds of people. You could, let's just close that. If you were to right click in here and hit assign fields, you can create a formula, which I've probably already done in the past, to be fair. If I scroll down, I've saved them in the past. Like you can set a formula so it picks up a value from the P80 and sends it to a user field. So you can send it to an empty user field. So you know how you might have 20 or so dormant, like if you go to reference, text, date, flag, decimals, duration. So you might pick a duration, like I've used one here in the past. I've probably used that. It says I've renamed it as well from duration 1 to deterministic. This is how I created my grey bars, was I'm anchoring the grey bars against this thing here. This will not change. I can multicolor it until I'm blue in the face, but 9 will always be 9 until someone overwrites it with another value manually. So that will always stay in place. But you could do right click, assign field, set a formula, pick the P80 duration, send it to an empty, not being used user field, export via the file. Remember I showed you export project, send as an XER, and then that user field, like duration 2, you tell them to import that or copy and paste from that into their P6 schedule, and then they can overwrite or create a kind of what if scenario in there. So yeah, dead easy. And I'm actually showing that duration that's the number that's being shown on the Gantt chart, by the way. So 50-day P80 duration for that final task, deterministic, was 40 days. So, okay, so that's some cool stuff that you can do. And I kind of tend to talk about that in terms of being like a detective mode when you're in the data view and, you know, jumping in and around. It just helps you find those needles in a haystack a bit faster. It's like bringing a magnet and understanding, you know, why is things doing this? Is this an anomaly and we need to fix it, or is this a real life, this could really happen? You know, really focus the minds. Okay, drivers. So the next place you tend to come to after getting a kind of typical histogram S-curve is your drivers. So this is using a correlation coefficient to rank, order the magnitude of the influence that one thing is having on another thing, which is great for very quick what is the worst thing that's going on, and you'll all be familiar with that. And if you're anything like me, you've probably also been in a situation where your stakeholder or your project director has then said, that's wonderful, Chris, but I already knew that that was going to be the top risk because I told you it was a high probability and high impact event. I've learned nothing. How much is it going to actually impact me by is the obvious next question, which is what sensitivity analysis is in Safran Risk. So it sort of evolves the concept. But before I show you sensitivity analysis, I just want to talk a little bit about what we've done here in Safran, that it just actually improves this a little bit more, which is, you recall we had the duration uncertainty, low, medium and high on the risk register. And because we have it on the risk register, it means that on the risk tornado graph, I've now got my discrete risk events and things, but also DU high when mapped against activity, or it's pinpointed against locating subcontractors and suppliers like we observed previously on the risk mapping screen. This is actually within my top, what, 6, certainly within my top 10 risks. Now that was not articulated as a risk, but the modelling has shown it to be a risk. So it's now something that I'm aware of that I wasn't aware of before, and it could have very big ramifications, particularly if you're in like oil and gas and you think that you have to get everything built onshore where it's going to be cheaper before exporting to offshore. So you put in a bunch of risks, but then you fail to recognise the estimating uncertainty effect and where they might actually have been your biggest risks all along. And this is the kind of thing that would have helped you find that out and save you millions and millions of pounds in that kind of setting, perhaps. So I just like flagging that as a neat function that we have there. But if you need to, you can go into the cost model. Maybe you want to go straight into materials or something and investigate. And you've got the power here under this tornado from the cost model to look at everything together, or just the cost from the cost model, what's influencing it the most, or the activity schedule, how's that driving cost, or the risks just from the risk register. So there's a nice little spread of functions there that enriches the experience of trying to track down and understand model behavior. But as I said, it's really when you want to evolve the concept further, you go to the sensitivity analysis. So just to explain what this is, you may have already done this in your previous projects yourselves. This is essentially where you are asked the question, but how much is that affecting me by? So you go, well, I don't know, I have to rerun the model, but this time without the risk on, therefore I'll be able to measure the delta. So if I was looking at P80 previously, I'll remodel it, but without that risk, and see what the P80 now looks like, and whatever the delta is, that's the answer. So this automatically does that for you. So if we put this onto cost, we'll have it on S curves. So I'm interested in the overall project and the overall project cost at P80 value. I then hit calculate impact. So the first thing you'll see is a black S curve. That's the one we've already just seen. That's the cumulative, all the risks switched on. But what it's doing now is it's reimagining what life would have looked like had one of those risks not been there. So do you remember on the risk register, each risk was assigned a unique color? That's where this comes in. You'll now see lots of different colors for each risk being turned off, and you can see how far back it moves in the from the overall position of all risks being switched on. And you could have done this, like for me, I certainly did one of my last project where it took me the best part of a week or more because we had quite a lot of risks and using PRA wasn't the easiest, having to create lots of extra files and things. It really slows you down, and of course introduces human error in the process. But here I just hit a button and a few moments later I've now got this. So I can see that as S curves. I can turn off and on individual things. So if I just want to see what's the weather one look like compared to the original baseline, that's the effect the weather risk was having on my testing phase. And what does that look like in terms of P80 schedule impact? Well, the answer is 38 days at P80 confidence, or £272,000 in terms of cost and interrelated costs, because you've got to remember I've got a fully integrated cost and schedule model. So if there was anything like the hiring of the airfield, which is dependent on the, that's where we're doing the testing. So the testing phase takes longer, we hire the airfield for longer. So if the wind blows, it takes longer. So there's costs that are related there. Okay, so I'm getting all of those kinds of things automatically filtered through in this view. It was very useful. And if you go to the other end of the spectrum, you can see on the tabular form though, you can see the outsourcing opportunity that we talked briefly about on one of the slides. And what's if you remember, the opportunity I think was a £5,000 upfront investment and additional 5 days of time. Well, I'm actually net effect, I'm actually saving 4 days overall, despite an investment, taking 5 more days. It feels like it's going to slow me down, but actually outsourcing it was a smart thing to do because of the big time savings elsewhere. And furthermore, that £5,000, well, it converted into 122,000 of savings. So this is because I used that blended approach of pre and post mitigated in the same model. I can now learn that, whereas I couldn't have done that if I was doing, or I couldn't have done it as easily with pre and then post separate models. But clearly you can do either or, but just demonstrating the capability, I guess. Similar to this, actually, if you were to then change what are you focusing on the project, if you were to go to project, I'm interested in the design phase instead, and what's really impacting the design phase. Now, I saw this the first time and I thought this was a bug, I have to admit, but it's not. This here tells me that my second biggest problem is the air transport required risk. Now, thematically, this makes no sense whatsoever. Why air transport, once I've created my product and I'm shipping it to my client at the end, or my customer at the end of the project, why has that got anything to do with finalizing the design? And it wasn't until I went back to the developers and I investigated with them, and they pointed out that what I'd done is because I was using the alternate position based on action toggle, blending my pre and my post mitigation together, meant that the post mitigated costs of mitigating the air transport risk, which meant upfront cost or investment to mitigate against it, to guarantee a booking of some extra trucks on the road or wherever it might have been, that was actually coming through and affecting the design phase because if you think about it sequentially, this is something that we deal with, or the mitigation is proposed and dealt with during procurement, which is in advance of finishing the design in this particular fictional project. So that also might have some useful connotations for you as well. So I'd just like to point that out. You can show it as a tornado if you prefer, and if you go into the options cog, you could also show the cost and the schedule tornadoes kind of in the same graphic. But you've got a table here on the left hand side. You can kind of click in here, hold down shift, copy, paste into Excel, and you can start manipulating somewhere else if you want to make a different looking report. But it's very useful information because you can now talk to people in the language of business, delay and cost and such like, at a certain confidence level. We'll pass because it's much faster. I was just saying the single pass method is reusing the existing 2000 iteration Monte Carlo we did originally. But if you wanted to get a more granular, more accurate answer, maybe before a final submission, and I really recommend that you would only do this in that situation, you would go to multiple pass method. And what that's going to do is it will do the single pass method first, which gives the computer system an understanding of the rank order. It then understands which order to then remove the risks in, rather than in a random order. It will now take them off in this particular order. And when it does that, it will then re-simulate a new 2000 iteration Monte Carlo on top of, so that it helps refine and increase the accuracy of the output, which means that all of the P80 values, if you were to sum them together, should total closer to the actual cumulative P80 that you see on the original output. So there's more variation at the moment with a single pass. And I appreciate that if you've got 200 risk on your risk register, then that's basically the same thing as saying run 201 Monte Carlos. So you might not want to do that. So under the multiple pass options, you can say, actually, let's just focus on the uncertainties that matter, the 80-20 rule. So maybe we just want to run the top 20 risks with multiple pass method rather than, all of them. So just little things like that will help you save a bit of time. But for day-to-day stuff, you just want to get a quick rough and ready. What's it doing now? single pass is probably sufficient for your needs. Okay, so moving through to the scatter plot. So the scatter plot, let's change that view for one moment. This will help explain it. For those that haven't seen the scatter plot before, essentially, because we're running two simulations, technically it's a single simulation, but with a cost variable and a schedule variable, it means that you can plot these side by side, and you can determine what's going on each axis. So you've got an X and Y axis. You can say, well, I could have finish date, but maybe it's easier to understand it as a duration. So redraws it as duration. I can now see I've got my 530 days deterministic all the way through to it doubling to about 1,000 or more days. So this is maybe an easier way of describing it. And then your other axis is cost. And what you can do, the default is going to be to use the deterministic. Okay, so let's just stick these on. So the deterministic is being used. The deterministic is a star symbol on this scatter plot, and it's all the way down here in the bottom left corner. So that's the 530 days and the whatever the deterministic cost was, 10.99 million, as shown in the stats window. And so if we were to start talking about contingency and where should we pitch it, someone might say add 10%. So they might just untoggle the use deterministic. So they can now change this and go, let's go for 583 days. This redraws one part of the crosshair, and then you could do similar on the other, and then you could add an amount of cost, and you might come up with a figure. Lick finger, wag in the air, and then go, oh, that's just terrible. That's not sufficient at all. You can see we've got a few green dots have now appeared. So we've nudged it along a little bit, but actually the chance or the probability statistically of ending inside this window or quadrant is basically 0%. So out of 2,000 sampled, we're just not ever going to get this. So you might then say, okay, Chris, but where should we pitch the contingency? You know, how do we do that? Do we just pick the center of the cloud, for instance? No, you don't. What you can do is use something called JCL, joint confidence level. So this is the statistical probability or p-value of achieving both your targets. So both your cost target and your schedule target. So what we can do to help ourselves is if we click this and go back to changing the color scheme from target values to JCL bands. So instead of it being kind of red is good, sorry, green is good, red is bad, it's now giving us a few different colors. So do you remember I used the options cog to choose my focus percentiles, and I said P1 through to P100. So I'm now getting those up here. And so P1, so this is not great. You know, this is where we're currently pitching our contingency. It's like hardly any chance that will succeed whatsoever, because many more of the scatter plots all ended up outside of those thresholds. Say we're interested in P80. So if I wanted to give a P80 value and redraw the crosshair, I would do so by looking at the color first of all and saying, well, okay, the P80 appears to be orange through to red. So it's this liminal zone where orange and red sort of buffer up against one another. And you can see that roughly creates a C or a curve shape, which means that if I hover over any plot, I can see that I get which iteration did that come from, what was the X coordinate time, Y coordinate cost, and what was the joint confidence level of pitching that as the contingency, P83. Okay, that's maybe a little too high, but it's roughly the ballpark of P80. Okay, so I can go all the way over here and be approximately P80, and similarly I can go up this end of the curve and also be about P80. So this one's P81. I could maybe drop it there, P78. So you can kind of have high confidence in one aspect over the other, just because when you redraw the crosshair to that point, the number of iterations out of the 2,000 would be 80% of them. So if you're looking to optimize and have a kind of argument-free discussion, effectively what you're looking for is the inflection point of the curve, somewhere in the kind of the center of the curve like this, and then you would pitch that and say, okay, can we all agree that we're going to at least go for Like there's a P80 value just there. So we're going to go for 783 days and 17.2 million. So 783 days and 7138. 138. So I'll redraw that crosshair. X-axis, I've forgotten already. It's 783. So I've now got, okay, that was close, not quite right, but 79. So I'm effectively P79 as a JCL, joint confidence level. So if there was a rationale, why did you pick here? It's because it was kind of the optimal point of not being more favouring cost overrun than schedule overrun and vice versa. It was kind of the optimal point. But it just reframes the discussion, reframes the debate, and gives you another tool to do so. What you can also do is, if we put it back on our cost, if we go to other costs, so do you remember we had the penalty fee that kicks in after a certain point, and it could be £100 a day delay penalty, so that would be the bottom of this cone shape. It could be £2,500 per day, which would be the top end of the cone shape, and anywhere in between. So that's the random sort of triangular distribution that we had. And then the quantity formula doubled it. So if it went into the following financial year, it doubles. So I can see that the quantity formula then explodes into life and then, you know, spreads the range open. So this just gives me some confidence that the formula that I created is working and behaving as I intended. So there's little things you can do here to look at specific parts of your model, not just the overall project, but you can look to see if there's things that are correlated, you know, between one another as well. So let's put that back to where it was. Okay, so I'll just talk about probabilistic cash flow briefly. So I've got this set to look at my cost module because that's where my costs are actually built in this case. I could look at any individual part, but I'll just happily keep it on the overall project. And then you can see again, you've got the legend, which is interactive, so I can switch on and off any of my focus percentiles, my P1 and whatnot. But I'm actually interested in P80, so I've got my P80 selected. I'm also interested in my cumulative curves, deterministic curves. So that's not drawn very nicely. I think that is under the options legend location. Let's put that to the top left. So you can see what I've got selected here. I could unpin all these things if I wanted to fill the screen up. And I've also got a scatter plot drawn on here as well. Some people might find that useful. You can turn that off if you don't like it. Again, legend is interactive. But now I can see the grey bars represent how much we expected deterministically to, you know, how much cost would we incur at any given time, and then the P80 risk adjusted position of that cash flow. So I can see that it peaks somewhat higher in certain months, in fact probably all months, but also where the project is supposed to be coming to an end, you know, towards these months at the end of the project here, the grey bars are shrinking down in size, but actually after the risks have been applied and the estimating uncertainties, actually the project continues at, you know, some rate, and the testing phase goes on because of weather and testing glitches and things. We end up hiring the airfield for longer, and you can see that cumulative cost or P80 position cost here, and then it shrinks off. So it gives you an idea of what that spend profile looks like, probabilistically speaking. And if you need to, you can hit this button here again for data view, and it will bring you up each period, how much cost was incurred deterministically versus the P80 and whatnot, and you can see that as cumulative or periodic. You can show that in days, weeks, whatever you need to, and it will just recalculate that. So maybe you need to see this as quarters, perhaps, or something like that. Or maybe your user case is that you have a funding limit that you know you're only going to be able to spend maybe £1 million in a given period. So it would be interesting to use this view to then see which points peak above that 1 million threshold. So there's all kinds of things that you might want to do with this. I'll move into distribution comparison then. So as was stated very early on at the very start, the Safran Risk is a database, which means that you can add as many of these reports through this button here, add report, and you get loads of these little sort of tiles, and you can create these for like formal purposes, like it could be every month I'm going to run a Monte Carlo and just save what the S-curve looked like each month, and you can then trend it like you saw a moment ago, flashed up on screen. Or maybe you just need to run a what if scenario. What if scope and we don't be that content. There's no upper limit, as I understand it, on how many S-curves you can put into any given report, and you can have lots and lots of reports as well. But if you were to open up and look at one of these, you can see here I've got lots and lots and lots and lots of S-curves all in this one single report. I'm trending that over time just by this button at the top. I can take that off and I can just have them as S-curves side by side. Trending mode might be the thing that is most helpful though. You know, this might be useful in helping tell a story as well. I mean, I've got another example for trending. This one here is good. So in this example, what I've done is every time I've sent an S-curve into the distribution comparison, I've been very disciplined and I renamed the curve to explain exactly what has changed about the model before I run the model. So this is where someone was saying, I'm not really sure what I'm doing, can you help me? And I'm refining their model for them. And I'm saying, okay, well, we're dealing with the COVID question. Now we're dealing with the equipment modeling question. Now we're dealing with a different question, so forth. Well, now we're changing the subcontractor or removing someone and the weather risk. And you can see that the P1 to the P100 almost as like a box and whisker kind of diagram now, and they're kind of closing in as time moves on, and I'm improving, refining the quality of the model, the underlying schedule logic, and then I then say, okay, but what about what's missing? What needs to be added in? And then you can see that the uncertainty or the volatility starts creeping up again. So again, it tells a narrative, it tells a story, there's space, notes. The table information is quite useful because you can anchor it against a particular thing. So the typical user cases, of course, pre-mitigated versus post-mitigated versus no risks, just the estimating uncertainty. You could look at finish dates, you could look at cost, but you can use the table information to say, I'm interested in the P80 and I want to anchor it and compare it against just duration uncertainty alone. What's the delta? What's the difference between that and that? And it will just automatically calculate it for you on the table. So that gives you a broad cost benefit analysis, or improved, you know, what's the net improvement, net position. There's a little bit of stats that's also captured under in this little bottom window here as well when you click on each curve. And you can share these as well. I'm assuming you'd be able to peek into one another's because you're on the same server, I think, or will be set up on the same server. But if not, then you'd be able to share them, export the graphs and things. Import and export. But yeah, largely for me, I think the benefit here is that you can create these kind of what if scenarios. Like I've got this one here, the how many drones scenario. So I mentioned about our customer, they're going to order an uncertain number of drones. The minimum they can order is 10,000 units. So I'm interested in comparing against the minimum order, and then I can re-rank the information. And so as you can see, I've rerun the model with 12,000 units, 14, 16, 18, up to a maximum of 20,000 units. That's the maximum we can supply. And I can see the delta at the P80 cost increasing by this much as we add on more and more thousands of units. So that's more and more materials required to create the drones, but it's also going to be higher labor cost, longer duration to assemble them all, etc. So I get that there. I've also got the duration sent in as well. And what I quite like about this is that once you've created those standalone scenarios, I then said, okay, but what about a scenario where I don't know how many units? So if that's the scenario where I knew it was 12,000 or 14,000, what if it was anywhere in between 10 and 20? So I created a distribution on the variable table. I then used the correlation matrix. I related it to various things on the cost model as well as the risk register, and was able to then create this new curve. which is this thick blue one that's now shown over there, which now intersects perfectly the P80 of the 14,000 units. So if I was to tell my senior team what to plan for, I would say plan for 14,000. You know, probabilistically speaking, at P80 confidence, that one's the one to go for based on what we know. So, you know, this is the power of sort of storytelling now, is when you start layering in these what ifs and changing the scope or changing something about the modeling and whether they're correlated or not correlated, the risk is mitigated or not. You can use this as a visualization to enhance that and start making recommendations to your stakeholders, who in turn can then say, thank you for giving me useful information. I can now you know, make a sensible decision based on this, rather than just you telling me what the top 10 risks were, which I probably knew what they were already because I already told you what the information was. So, you know, it changes the emphasis and focus of the conversation with stakeholders and should uplift the value of the kind of the risk modeling process and team. Okay, I'll move to critical path, and that pretty much will conclude the training, I think, unless there's any final questions. So the purpose of the critical path map is to offer an alternative method to exploring near critical paths. So the first thing that you'll see, or should see, is if you have more than one critical path or near critical path, they'll show down here after you've run a simulation. So I've got path 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and of 2,000 iterations, the sequence of events of path 1 was adopted, or the sequence of events in path 2 were adopted 34% of the time, and so forth. So I can see which one's my most stable path, and that's the first thing. The second thing is I can sort of step through. I don't have to, that is defaulting to the overall project, but maybe I'm interested in what gets me to the finalizing of design. So if I click that, it will reorganize the information on the screen and show me just the activities leading up to that milestone. Okay, so that's quite important. Now, the first thing I learn is path 1 is used 100% or adopted 100% of the time. That sequence will always occur. And that's perfectly accurate, it's perfectly correct, because it's a very simple project. There's only 30 or so activities. I know that the deviation in the project where the paths may split actually come towards the fabrication or construction phase of the project. So as we step through and go to, say, this one here, paths 1, 2, and 3 now open up. So I can spot quite clearly where the paths are diverging. If I just move these windows around a little bit, I'll change that from years. Let's put that quarters. So that will fit it all on the screen a bit better. But you can see here that you get the activity information, the criticality. So it's essentially the same thing. What's the frequency that it was on the critical path? And you get a little Gantt chart view. And just to help, or an alternative view of it, is you can see on the Gantt chart here that you've got the activities, what path on, and then if you spot a gap, drop down and you can see the paths, and these are the splits. So it's just another visual way of doing it. And then on the right hand side, this is pretty much the last thing, is the the path plot. So this S-curve looking diagram, the important axis is this one here, duration. So this means if I just turn off some of those paths. So we're just looking at path number 1. So 48% of the time, this is the sequence that is adopted after being stressed by all the risks and uncertainties. And actually path 1, what I've learned is that it can be really long duration at the top right corner here. It can also be very short duration, and it can also be everywhere in between. So that means that path is pretty robust, I would say. And I might look at a different path. Let's look at path 3. And path 3 is kind of similar, and it's maybe a little bit longer duration, but also we've got some short duration and everywhere pretty much in between. But when you run this on a real life schedule, you might find clusters or pockets where some paths are longer than others, just as a feature, or as as part of their nature. So you get to explore a little bit about the paths themselves and how they compare against others, which might open up a few other options of conversations, such as how do we encourage path number 7 to occur, because we quite like path 7. It looks really stable. It keeps occurring here in the path plot, you know, something like that. But what we've heard from some of our other customers is that when they've been using this, it's helped them spot anomalies. So you see down here where it says paths 5 and 6, 1%, 0%. So just a few of the random iterations has ended up in a completely different sequence of events. And you start investigating it, and then you realize actually that's an anomaly of the logic. That doesn't make sense. So despite doing schedule checks, schedule warnings, and all this kind of validation and stuff, actually something like this might pick up a few other oddities that might need correcting, or you learn something new and go, oh, that can happen, and then you know might want to report on that. So, but there we are. I think that pretty much concludes what I can fit in the time, and we've managed to get from left to right on the black ribbon. But don't forget the sample data, burger menu, top right corner, open user log file, and you just drill down a few from risk sample data, and then you've got a few project files. And remember, that's importing a .spx, that's the schedule file. Then this one here would be the risk model. You've got to have both parts, otherwise you just got a schedule with no risks, you know.